And thanks for joining us for the Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. I'm your host, Peter Slem. Our guest this week is Wall Street Journal columnist Jason Riley. We'll be discussing his newest book, The Affirmative Action Myth, and that podcast begins in a moment. Jason Riley's longtime Wall Street Journal columns appear on Wednesdays. He often writes about domestic politics and race matters. His new book, The Affirmative Action Myth, is about both. In it, he contends that African Americans were progressing professionally and socially at a faster rate before the affirmative action and civil rights legislation of the 1960s and 70s. Our conversation with Jason Riley begins now. Wall Street Journal columnist Jason Riley is the author of this book, The Affirmative Action Myth: Why Blacks Don't Need Racial Preferences to Succeed. Mr. Riley, in theory, is affirmative action a worthy goal?
In theory, I guess it depends on which definition of affirmative action you're working from. A lot of this debate can get bogged down in semantics. So one of the first things I try to do in the book is to lay out a definition, a working definition of affirmative action. Initially, the phrase meant, and this is going back to the late 60s, simple outreach to groups that had traditionally and historically been overlooked, including blacks and particularly blacks, and offering to bring those groups into the fold to lift them up to existing standards, whether it be in hiring or admissions to colleges and so forth. What it has become, however, is racial preferences, set-asides, quotas. So if you're talking about affirmative action under the first definition, yes, I think that is a worthy goal, and that is something that large majorities of Americans have long supported. What it has become, however, racial preferences, set-asides, racial favoritism, is not a worthy goal, particularly in a increasingly pluralistic, multiracial, multi-ethnic society like we have. I think race preferences are a disaster. And so again, it depends on which definition you're working off of.
So going back to the late 60s, how and when did affirmative action come to fruition?
Well, it's a long story. Actually, the late 60s is almost starting in the middle of the story. It really goes back to the 40s and 50s, desegregating the military, efforts, coming out of World War II to increase the number of workers in society, and then offering jobs to blacks who traditionally been blocked out under Jim Crow laws and so forth. So it really starts back then. What happened in the 60s is you get some civil rights legislation passing. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is, of course, following up the Brown decision out of the Supreme Court in the 1950s. And that really gets you into the modern sort of affirmative action era, and where things really picked up in terms of hiring and college admissions was after Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. There were unrests nationwide, including on college campuses, and there was a stepped-up effort to reach out to black students in particular on college campuses and bring them into the fold, and that sort of brings you into the modern era of affirmative action, which I date to the late 1960s. In terms of work requirements, or I should say work policies, the first indication from the federal government that they would change that definition of outreach to lowering standards comes in the early 1970s, where you get federal guidelines calling for quotas and set-asides and timetables. And so I date in the book the affirmative action, first full decade of affirmative action being the 1970s. And I'm doing a comparison of black trends prior to the 1970s versus what we saw under that era of affirmative action beginning in the 1970s.
Who were some of the drivers in Congress of affirmative action?
In terms of passing
of developing it and passing it, yes.
Well, in passing the civil rights bills, you had people like Hubert Humphreys in the Senate, which led the effort over there. You had other people in the House leading the effort. But I guess the problem is not what the authors of these bills meant when they put in place what they thought were colorblind um, policies going forward. That's what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was really about. It was about pushing for a colorblind policy. What the problem are all of these anonymous bureaucrats that we've had, particularly in the federal government and in various federal agencies. Today, they'd be called the administrative state. But those are the folks who, along with the blessing of the judiciary, the court system, transformed colorblind policies into color conscious policies. And that is the real problem. And that is what we are still dealing with the fallout of today. Bureaucrats and courts that have ignored the plain language of the laws, the plain intent of people like Humphreys and others to push for colorblind policies and just used verbal jujitsu to turn that plain language into something oftentimes the opposite of what the language says. And that is the problem.
Well, in your book, you quote Martin Luther King saying, "One of the sure signs of maturity is the ability to rise to the point of self-criticism." What does that entail?
Well, I think that's indicative of the mindset of the black leadership back then. I think that was the civil rights movement at its finest in the 1950s and 60s under King, under Thurgood Marshall, Whitney Young, and those folks running the NAACP at the time. They were pushing for not only colorblind policies, but they were also pushing what today is derided as respectability politics. And by that I mean they thought it was very important how black people carried themselves, black behavior, black personal responsibility. They thought the push for civil rights went hand in hand with how blacks presented themselves in this country, both to whites and to one another. They thought, yes, that would be conducive to winning civil rights victories, but they thought that certain attitudes and habits and behaviors were simply conducive to upward mobility, regardless of when those victories would come. And that's a very, very different attitude than what you hear today out of the black leadership, such that it is, groups like Black Lives Matter or black elites in academia and the media who do not want to talk about black behavior. That is a taboo subject. They want to talk about white behavior. And that's a very, very different mindset than what people like Martin Luther King brought to the table with quotes like the one you just cited.
Jason Riley, should race be considered as a defining character when it comes to education, employment, society writ large?
No, no, I don't believe that it should. I mean, obviously, there are racial differences in America, in our society, cultural differences, ethnic differences. But when it comes to public policy and how the government treats us, treats the population, no, it should not be picking winners and losers based on race or treating people differently based on race. It's been a disaster, whether the effort was under Jim Crow to elevate whites or the effort was under racial preferences to elevate non-whites. It's been a disaster. People like to say that diversity is our strength in America, but I disagree. Our real strength in this country has been to overcome our racial and ethnic differences and focus on what unites us as a country. That has been the strength of America. Racial and ethnic differences have torn societies apart the world over down through history. And America has largely, I think, survived with a focus on focusing on what unites us. And obviously, we have done an imperfect job of doing that. But that has been the goal, that has been the objective, and I think we are better off as a country because of that.
Do you see the DEI initiatives as a natural outgrowth of the affirmative action movement?
Yes, I absolutely do. And I think, one of the reasons I wrote this book was because of the chatter around the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard Supreme Court case that was decided back in 2023. And that ruling, that ultimate ruling, was very much anticipated. People looked at the makeup of the court and said that there are probably enough conservatives there that these policies, these race preference policies, are probably going to go away. And I think the DEI effort, which began obviously before that Supreme Court decision, saw the writing on the wall, and that will be used as a way to replace or undo what the Supreme Court is doing by striking down race preferences. I think DEI is largely, race preferences by another name.
Jason Riley is a columnist with the Wall Street Journal. How often do you write, and what do you write about?
I write once a week for the paper. I write a column there once a week. I used to be a member of the editorial board on staff at the Journal. I did that for 20 odd years, and then left about 10 years ago to join the Manhattan Institute, a think tank in New York City. And now I just write the weekly column for the paper. I mostly write about politics, race, crime, education, immigration, mostly domestic public policy, urban public policy. I write a lot about urban economics, minimum wage laws, and tax policy in the city and so forth. So that's mainly what I write about in the column, and it's also what most of my books have been about.
Can you write about anything you want, and how many words do you get a week?
Yes, I can write about whatever I want. I generally, though, stick to domestic public policy. I don't write a lot about foreign policy. I get 800 words a week, which is not a lot of space, but people don't have a lot of time, so it's probably enough space.
Is this your fifth book, The Affirmative Action Myth?
I believe it's my sixth book.
Sixth book.
Yeah.
All right. Well, one of the themes of this book is you look at pre-affirmative action legislation success track for blacks, and you start by with an FDR decision in 1941, the Fair Employment Practices Committee. What was that?
Well, that was an effort by the federal government to do exactly what it says. Um, Fair employment in this country. You're talking about the 1940s, so this is peak Jim Crow. So particularly in the South, there are laws in place where that treat blacks and whites differently. And FDR said the federal government is going to not do that, or he doesn't. We're going to take steps in the federal government to move away from that sort of thing. Now, FDR is not doing this sort of out of the goodness of his heart. He's under pressure by black civil rights activists at the time who are pressuring him to do this, threatening marches on Washington if he doesn't do this. And so he does it under some duress, and it's a compromise. These activists wanted him to go even further, but this is what he settles on. They call off their march, and that was sort of that march ultimately came to fruition under Martin Luther King some years later. But that was one of the early efforts to put pressure on the federal government.
And FDR's executive order regarding employment was specifically about defense, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, we it was World War II, and we were ramping up production in this country. We had a wartime economy, and there was a job shortage, and so tight labor markets. We needed workers, and again, this was something done under duress. But historically, that has been when blacks have experienced the most amount of economic progress. When labor markets have been tight and they have had access to those labor markets. And so we see that in the 1940s and 50s. We see it in the 60s when we had a growing economy. We also saw it, by the way, during Donald Trump's first term before the pandemic. We had tight labor markets, a growing economy, and you saw black wages rising at a faster rate than white wages at that time. You saw record low levels of black unemployment, record low levels of black poverty, and that fits a pattern that we've seen throughout the 20th century.
What's your take on A. Philip Randolph and his impact on civil rights?
Well, he had a huge impact. He was one of the people pressuring FDR back in the 40s to do what he did. Again, Randolph wanted FDR to go further, and we wouldn't see that until we saw pressure from Dr. King and others. But A. Philip Randolph was one of the pioneers in this effort, and deserves a lot of credit for making the civil rights movement as successful as it was in the mid 20th century.
Well, another incremental change you note in your book is when Harry Truman desegregated the military. What was the impact of that?
Well, again, this is the federal government trying to lead the way and doing what it can, even while the private sector is dragging its feet, or while state and local governments are dragging their feet. And of course, the federal government, as we're learning today, the federal government can have a lot of leverage over state and local activity, particularly if it is giving state and local governments money and can put conditions on that money. And so these were efforts, whether it was FDR, whether it was Eisenhower, whether it was Truman, there were efforts there to move the ball. Again, it was slow and not as successful as many people would have liked. But things were moving in the right direction. And the focus, again, and this is what I really want to stress, is that the focus was on equal opportunity, not special treatment for Black people. And that has been when traditionally, historically in this country, we've seen the biggest gains among Blacks, is when the focus is on equal rights and not special rights. And that is a movement you saw dating back to FDR and moving on with various administrations after his, both Republican and Democrat.
Well, there's a lot of statistics in the book, and I want to quote some of them here. In 1940, 87% of blacks were below the poverty line, and 5% of black employees had white-collar jobs. Between 1940 and 1960, the black poverty rate fell to 47%. In 1950, there were 50,000 black college graduates in total. Between 1939 and 60, 568% increase in black income. In 1960 as well, 2 out of 3 black children lived with 2 parents. And between 1950 and 1970, black males in professional roles increased 198%. And then you go on to say that in 1970 to 1990, there was only a 27% increase in black males in professional roles. What should we take from what we just read there?
Well, what you really have to do is not just look at those numbers in absolute terms, but what's really helpful, and what I try and do in the book, is compare those black gains over the period being discussed to white gains over the same period. And what you see often is that both groups were making gains, but the black gains were faster. The black rate of upward mobility was higher than the white rate of upward mobility. So it's not just that both groups were making gains. Blacks were gaining on whites. Inequality was being reduced. The gap was narrowing. And that's what we saw happening at a much faster rate in the pre-affirmative action era. I mean, as I mentioned before, one of the reasons I wrote the book was because of the Supreme Court decision that was being handed down in 2023. And I heard all this chatter, all this doomsaying coming out, particularly out of the left and mainly out of the elite left, about what would happen if race preferences went away. And it was this apocalyptic prognosis that, oh, these black people will go, you know, we're gonna halt all upward mobility. We're gonna whitewash higher education if we get rid of racial preferences. And I wanted to say, wait a minute, that is not what the historical record shows. You mentioned the poverty decline among blacks between 1940 and 1960, a 40-point reduction in poverty from 87% to 47%. That's before, that's not only before affirmative action, long before affirmative action or DEI, that's before the Civil Rights Act of 64. That's before the Voting Rights Act of 65. That's before blacks had any kind of political clout in this country, before black mayors were running large cities with large black populations. This is before all of that. Black people lifted themselves out of poverty, and that the idea that race preferences did this, that affirmative action did this, is not something supported by the data. Now, blacks continued to make gains in the 1970s in the affirmative action era, but at a much, much slower rate than what was going on beforehand. And one of my central arguments is that, if anything, the affirmative action era throttled black upward mobility, but it can hardly be credited with what we've seen in terms of black upward mobility in this country. Things were moving at a much faster pace in the first two-thirds of the 20th century than they would be after 1970. And you cite some of the data there, educational gains, economic gains. You could also look at home ownership, incomes. And then you can also look at that data and see where things stalled. So you mentioned college attendance, college completion. This is another thing where there was a convergence between the black rate of college completion and the white rate of college completion. There was a convergence occurring. Blacks and whites were both increasing their rate of completion of college, but the black rate was growing faster. That starts to stall in the 1970s. I cite some data in the book from Robert Putnam, the Harvard professor, who says that college completion today among blacks is where it was in 1970. So after more than a half century of affirmative action policies, that's what it has produced in terms of black college completion.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. Do you draw a conclusion as to why?
Oh, there are several reasons, and I lay them out in the book. One is that what affirmative action does in terms of college completion and college attendance is mismatch kids with schools. So white kids and Asian kids tend to go to schools where they match the capabilities, academic preparation of the surrounding students at that institution. Whereas you have blacks being funneled into these elite schools, very selective colleges, where they lack the academic credentials of their surrounding peers. And when that happens, you get kids that are struggling, pooling at the bottom of the class, more likely to drop out, more likely to switch to easier majors. So you have this mismatch effect that is going on. And that has been one of the reasons I think you've seen those outcomes in terms of college completion. When before the Supreme Court decision in 2023 on college admissions, several states, I believe 9 or 10 states, had already banned racial preferences, including big diverse states. California had done it, Texas, Florida, Arizona, Michigan. So we had some natural experiments out there in terms of what might happen after these race preferences went away. And California is a good example, and I cite this in the book because they banned race preferences in college admissions back in the mid-1990s, so a long time ago. And what we saw out in California was that black enrollment at the most selective schools in the UC system, Berkeley, UCLA, did decline initially. But black enrollment throughout the University of California system went up significantly after affirmative action had been banned. Not only did enrollment go up, but more importantly, black graduation rates went up significantly, including in the more difficult STEM fields, science, engineering, mathematics, and so forth. So a policy that had been put in place, affirmative action, to increase the ranks of the black middle class had in practice been resulting in fewer black doctors and lawyers and engineers than you would have had in the absence of the policy. And so affirmative action, you can criticize it in terms of whether it's constitutional. You can criticize it in terms of whether it makes sense to play racial favorites in a country as diverse as ours. And then you can just question whether it works. And I think the track record shows that it not only doesn't work, it tends to harm the intended beneficiaries.
Jason Riley, did the perception of black workers, black students change after affirmative action became the law of the land?
Yes, I think, and the reason is because there became a stigma associated with black achievement. And there have been a number of professional blacks, successful blacks that have pointed this out. that affirmative action taints Black achievement. People assume that if you were successful and you were Black, you got there because someone cut you a break, because someone hired you as the token, someone hired you so they could cross off of a box, but that you don't really deserve what you've achieved. And so, yes, it has tainted that. Let me just tell you a story. It's not something limited to Black achievement. You may recall that a few years ago, um, when Elizabeth Warren was accused of claiming Native American ancestry to advance her career, Harvard professor, and so forth, she pushed back. She gave an interview to Boston Globe, I believe, saying, I got where I got because I deserved to be there. I didn't get there because someone was checking off a box or filling some affirmative action quota. I deserved the achievements that I've received, and don't accuse me of that sort of thing. And that's the way any self-respecting person, I think, would respond. Who wants to be the token hire? Who wants to be the token on campus? Nobody. No self-respecting person wants to be that way. The irony, of course, is that people on Elizabeth Warren's side of the aisle politically think nothing of how race preferences taint Black achievement. I mean, Elizabeth Warren doesn't want her achievements tainted by these policies, but apparently thinks that it's okay to give race preferences to Black people. So, but yes, I think attitudes have changed towards Black achievement because of these policies. The other thing that Elizabeth Warren is a good example of is an elite, intellectual elite that supports these policies. And one of the reasons, in terms of Blacks, that you get a lot of elites supporting these policies because to the extent that affirmative action has been successful, the benefits have tended to go to the Black elite, to upper income Blacks. They've been the ones who have benefited the most from these policies, even though the policies have been sold in the name of helping the Black poor. It's upper income Blacks that have reaped the benefits. And there's statistics I cite in the book, one having to do, I mean, if you go back to the late 1960s, the highest earning Blacks, people in the top 20% of the income distribution, between the late 1960s and the early 1990s, so first 25 years or so of affirmative action, those top earning Blacks saw their share of income grow at about the same rate as the top white income earners. But the bottom 20% of Black earners over the same period, saw their share of income decline at more than double the rate of their white counterparts in the bottom 20%. So after 25 years of affirmative action, you see who benefits. So it's no surprise to me that when the Supreme Court handed down this decision, you saw Black elites from Barack Obama and Michelle Obama on down, cable news host, Black elites in the media, and so forth, denouncing this. But that was a very self-serving analysis of what was happening. They've been the ones who have benefited from these policies, even though they're sold in the name of helping the Black underclass.
You write in your book that you too faced that misperception.
Oh, yes. I relate a story of being in college, and I had received a job offer from the local paper in the city where I went to school. And I ran into a colleague of mine from the school paper where I had worked and told her the news, and she sort of said, that's great for you, Jason. I heard they were looking for minorities at the local paper. And so I don't think she meant anything from it. We were on very friendly terms, but it was something that still sort of stung. And I think I'm not alone in that. Clarence Thomas writes about this in his memoir, the Supreme Court justice, when he was coming out of law school in the 70s. He comes out of Yale Law School, very selective school, but already by then, law firms had assumed that Black graduates of Yale got in because of the color of their skin, not because of their capabilities. So that degree was very tainted, and he saw that firsthand when he was out there looking for a job out of law school.
Where did you go to school, and did you develop your political philosophy early on?
I went to school in upstate New York, in Buffalo, where I was born and raised. I went to SUNY Buffalo. And probably I would say, in terms of when my political sensibilities developed, I didn't come from a very political family. We didn't sit around the dinner table discussing politics. I did come from a very religious family, my mother in particular, and so attended church 3 times a week. And so there was probably a cultural conservatism that was always there throughout my childhood. But in terms of politics, that's something I sort of happened upon mostly in college and uh, working on the school paper. Sort of began to think about these things, these issues that I still write about today, back then, and particularly after being introduced to the works of Thomas Sowell, the economist, who's based out at the Hoover Institution, who's cited in this book and is cited in most of my books, and I had a huge impact on my intellectual development on how I think about a lot of these issues. Not because I necessarily agree with everything he's written, although I do agree with a great deal of it, but just his style of argumentation, his wide range, his focus on on thinking empirically, gathering the data, following that data to its logical conclusions and so forth. That really made an impact on me, and I date that to my college days.
And in fact, you've written a biography of Thomas Sowell, haven't you?
I have. I wrote an intellectual biography of Soul that came out a few years ago.
Are you still in touch with him?
Yes. Every so often, he's in his mid 90s now. I believe he'll be 95 this year, in June, the end of June. And so when I'm out in California, he's based out at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. I let him know, and sometimes we get together and have lunch. And if he's back east, he'll give me a call. So yes, we stay in touch and we email each other from time to time.
Mr. Riley, in your newest book, The Affirmative Action Myth, you write that Thomas Sowell felt more respected in the 60s than he did in the 70s. What do you mean?
Yes, he wrote that in his memoir that when he came out of school, out of undergraduate, or he went to work on his PhD starting in the early 60s, but didn't complete his dissertation until the late 60s. And in the interim, he was teaching at various schools around the country while he was working on his PhD. And there were people who assumed if he was where he must have gotten there because he's a pretty bright guy. And he says in the 70s this changed, where people made assumptions about black academics and professors, and negative assumptions, saying that if they are black professors in economics and prestigious schools, somebody must have cut some slack for them because they wanted more black people on campus or in the faculty lounge. And he says the irony is that you know in the 60s I was much less accomplished. I published fewer papers. I didn't even have my PhD yet. And I was more respected than I was after I had done all that in the 1970s. And I cite Sowell, but I also cite the late Walter Williams, who was a professor of economics at George Mason University, and before that at Temple. And he was a little younger than Sowell, and tells stories about trying to teach economics to undergraduates and him getting a sense that they didn't really think he knew his stuff, and he would have to perform mathematical equations on the board to sort of explain how to do this, how to understand this concept mathematically. And until he did that, he didn't feel like he had earned the respect of some of the people he was teaching and so forth. So it's a widespread phenomenon, that stigma that is attached to affirmative action, and it's something that the justices laid out in their majority opinion in the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard case. They talk about stereotyping, and so you know, if you go to an elite school and you're a white person or an Asian person, and the black people that are at the school with you tend to be pooling at the bottom of the class, or tend to be switching to easier majors or even dropping out in higher numbers. When you leave college, what impression of black people do you have? I mean, and this again is a stereotype created by affirmative action and by this mismatch effect. And the real tragedy here is that many of these students who are admitted to your Harvards, your Dukes, your University of Michigans with lower standards than the whites and Asians at that school. These black students have test scores that tend to be well above the national average for all kids. They're just not as high as their peers at Duke and Harvard, which is to say that at a less selective school, these same black kids who are struggling at Duke would be hitting it out of the park at North Carolina State. They're at Duke because the administrators at Duke want them on campus for window dressing. They want them on campus so that the college catalog looks like America. Whether it is in the best interest of that student to be at that school, whether that school is the best match, is a secondary concern for these institutions. And I think that's a tragedy. You're turning these kids into artificial failures. There was a study done by a Duke professor who was an expert witness in the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard case. And it was a study of freshmen at Duke University, male freshmen, and he asked black males what they wanted to major in as freshmen, and he asked white males what they wanted to major in as freshmen. And he found that something like 75% or so of the black males wanted to major in either economics or one of the natural sciences. But only about 35% of them actually ended up getting a degree in that field. Among whites, so among blacks, you're talking about a 30-something point attrition rate. Among whites, the attrition rate was 4 percentage points. The kicker here is that the difference in who stuck with those majors and who did not could be determined by looking at incoming SAT scores. Duke admits, like all these elite schools do, Duke admits some black kids that do meet the requirements of the other kids at the school, and some who don't. Their attrition rate could be explained entirely by those kids Duke had admitted, those black kids Duke had admitted, who did not meet the requirements of the average student at Duke. So those kids were being done no favors by being shoehorned into Duke University. If they had gone to some other school, a less selective school, they probably could have majored in economics or chemistry or mathematics or physics and done just fine. They just couldn't do that major at Duke, and they were funneled into Duke anyway. And so that is the mismatch effect. That is the stereotyping that can take place. And I think it's a huge problem. And it's one of the reasons I'm grateful that the Supreme Court ruled the way that it did.
But the Scholastic Aptitude Test, the SAT, some scholars have said it has a bias to it, correct?
That's been the accusation. I don't think that's a charge that holds up to scrutiny at all. The SAT is a very good predictor of how a student will do that first year in school, and that's all it's supposed to do. And if anything, it overpredicts how black kids will do, not underpredicts. So no, I don't believe that that holds up. And there have been tons of studies out there that show that this bias charge is not something that stands up to scrutiny.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. Mr. Riley, in your book, you cite a couple of popular culture examples, the movie Hidden Figures and the television show Good Times. How do they fit into your argument?
Well, the Hidden Figures movie, which was based on a book that had been written a few years earlier, is telling the story of these black female mathematicians that had been hired by the predecessor to NASA, by the federal government back in the 40s and 50s. It's just an example of what blacks were able to accomplish during peak Jim Crow, during a time when there was a tremendous amount of racism in this country, a tremendous amount of violence towards blacks, but they were evidence that black upward mobility was possible and happening in this country at the time. So I tell the story. A lot of people are unfamiliar with the fact that black female mathematicians helped put us in space, put us on the moon. And it's a very inspiring tale that I think more people should know about and be celebrating. And it's I use it because so many people today say that the lack of upward mobility, the lack of proportionate outcomes in terms of race, the lack of racial balance at various elite institutions or in various occupations is due to racism. And until we eliminate racism, we should not expect to see this sort of upward mobility. So I go to, you look at a book like Hidden Figures or the experience of the people described in that book, and you say, wait a minute, look at what black people were accomplishing. I use the figures. We have the data there too, the poverty figures that we discussed earlier. But this, we also have stories to tell about what was happening at the time, and this is one example of that. And these folks clearly face far more racism than exists today in society, far more racial violence than exists today in society, and yet they were able to make these tremendous gains. And so I don't think that racism can be used as a blanket explanation for racial inequality today if we have experiences like we do of the people depicted in that movie and in that book. Good Times was a popular sitcom from the 1970s. And the reason I mention it in my book is because of the dispute among some of the actors on the show, some of the writers on the show. The two male, the two leads, the male and the female lead on the show, the parents, I should say, because they didn't. Over time, one of the sons became the real star of the show, JJ. But the mother and the father of this black family in real life were in constant argument with the writers of the show who were white and how they were depicting this family. And the show was set in housing projects in Chicago, and the matriarch of the family and the patriarch of the family did not like the way lines were written, the way their son's character was written, and the language he used, and how he carried himself. And I go into how old that, when those actors were born, and the experience they were drawing from when they had these disputes with the writers of the show. And these are people who came out of the 1920s and 30s and 40s when Black America looked a lot different. And there was a focus on Black behavior and how Blacks carried themselves and so forth. And they wanted that depicted in the characters in the show. And so there were these constant run-ins. And so I just tell the story of this show and those disputes, and then I get into the data about Black people coming out of the 30s and 40s and why those actors were so upset with how the show was depicting Black people.
Yeah, and John Amos was ultimately fired or left the show because he didn't like the perception of the Black family on the show,
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And if you were a Black person raised at a time when he was, I forget exactly when he was born. I want to say the late 30s or the early 40s. He probably would have been around my parents' age. But Black America just looked a lot different. There were way more intact families back then, Black intact families back then. You mentioned earlier the statistic on the 2 out of 3 Black kids being raised with a mother and a father in the home as recently as the early 60s. There are also data on marriage rates. For the first 4 or 5 decades of the 20th century, Black marriage rates were higher than white marriage rates in this country. You might not know that today, but there was a time when that was the case. And I think in the breakdown of that Black nuclear family, I think is why we saw so many of the trends in the pre-affirmative action later stall, and in some case reverse course in the post-affirmative action era, because the Black family broke down. So you look at something like income, And again, you saw this convergence in terms of black income as a percentage of white income getting higher and higher and higher in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And then sometime right around the late 60s and the early 70s, you start to see a divergence again in black incomes versus white incomes. And one of the reasons is this proliferation of black single parent homes. And just on economic terms, it's going to be very hard for a single parent home to compete economically with a two parent home, just in terms of how much money is being brought in. And so the family breakdown has direct economic consequences that you still see to this day from the breakdown of the black nuclear family.
And you write in your book, racial preferences and a rapidly expanding welfare state seem to have done little to address black poverty.
Yes, yes. And one of the reasons is because the welfare state, however well intentioned, has tended to subsidize the behaviors that drive black poverty and black unemployment rates. I mean, if you're going to pay someone not to work, you're going to get people making a rational decision not to work. Or if you're going to pay them so much in either cash or in kind benefits, pay them more money than they would ever be able to earn in a job, they have no incentive to go out into the labor force and look for that job. If you're going to tell a mother of a child that if the father is caught living in the house or hanging around the house too often, you're going to cut off government benefits, you are giving an incentive for people to be absent fathers. And that is what the welfare state has done. Again, a lot of well-intentioned efforts here, but they've been perverse in sort of the incentives that they've put in place. In terms of the welfare benefits, we saw a little bit of this during COVID, when employers had difficulty luring workers back into the office because the government was providing subsidies to unemployment benefits. And the employers couldn't compete with the money that was coming from the government. So people were saying, hey, I'm making more money staying home than I am going to work. And so that again is a sort of microcosm of what we've seen since the late 60s in terms of an expanded welfare state.
In your book, you also look at the issue of reparations. What's the argument for, the argument against?
Well, the argument for slavery reparations is that this country made money off of slave labor, and slave labor provided by black people. And so it should pay black people back, which would be a very compelling argument if there were still slaves alive to receive that money, and if there were still slave owners alive to pay it. But of course, both of those groups are long gone. So that's one of the arguments against doing it. In fact, the most white people in America date their ancestry to people who came to this country after the end of the Civil War. So the pro reparationist crowd wants white people who aren't even descendants of slave owners to pay reparations to black people who were never slaves. And that's a hard sell. That's a very, very hard sell. The other problem with reparations, I think, is pragmatically, it comes down to just another huge wealth redistribution scheme. And we've tried huge wealth redistribution schemes in this country time and again. The Great Society programs of the 1960s are perfect examples. We spent trillions of dollars redistributing wealth. If wealth redistribution solved poverty or eliminated income inequality, we would have solved these problems a long time ago. And I have no faith that yet another wealth redistribution scheme will be any more successful than the ones that we've tried in the past.
Here are some more statistics from your book, The Affirmative Action Myth. In 2024, white households held $134.5 trillion in assets, which was 84% of all assets, whites being 58% of the population. Black households had 5.3% of the assets and were 14% of the population. Median wealth, white households 284,000, black households 44,000. And then you write that the idea, but for slavery and segregation, we would see racially proportionate outcomes among black Americans in everything from labor force participation and earnings to academic achievement, home ownership, criminal behavior, and even health outcomes doesn't come close to passing scrutiny. Could you explain that?
Yes, a lot of the sort of social justice advocacy is premised on this notion that equal outcomes, or something approaching equal outcomes, racially proportionate outcomes, are the natural state of things, and that but for discrimination or exploitation, that's what you would see. But people who have studied societies down through history have never seen this racial balance in outcomes that the social justice advocates take as the starting point, as the norm, and assume that where we don't see it, something nefarious might be going on. We just don't see it. Outcomes vary between nations, between races, between people of the same race. And so to have that as your starting point is, I think, a rather utopian notion. And to argue that all racial disparities are a product of racial discrimination, I think is something, again, that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Western Europe is far richer than Eastern Europe. And in fact, and there you're talking about mostly two sets of white people. And the per capita income difference between Eastern Europeans and Western Europeans is larger than the black-white difference in America. So there you have a situation where you're dealing with mostly whites, and you have a wider disparity economically than you do among whites and blacks in America. Also, this notion that discrimination is a blanket explanation for inequality is not supported by the experience of other groups, either internationally or here at home. You can look at the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia. You can look at Indians in Uganda. You can look at the Igbos in Nigeria. You can look at the Lebanese in West Africa, and on, and Jews throughout the world. These are all examples of minority groups who have been discriminated against, either by custom or de jure by law, subsequently outperforming the people doing the discriminating, economically, academically, or sometimes both. And here in America, again, we have numerous examples of this. Asian Americans, Chinese Americans were lynched, couldn't own land in parts of California, were forced to attend separate schools. Japanese Americans were placed in internment camps. Asian Americans today outperform white Americans, both academically and economically, and have for decades. So there are many examples of discrimination not being this all-purpose explanation, and so you can't. To me, it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny to make that claim, and yet that is what a lot of social justice advocacy is all about.
You have a chapter in your book called Poetic Truths. I want to play a little bit of video that fits in with that theme. Here it is.
Last year alone, 19 states not proposed, but enacted 34 laws attacking voting rights. There were nearly 400 additional bills Republican members of state legislatures tried to pass. And now, Republican legislators in several states have already announced plans to escalate the onslaught this year. Their end game? To turn the will of the voters into a mere suggestion, something states can respect or ignore. Jim Crow 2.0 is about two insidious things: voter suppression and election subversion.
Jason Riley, can you help us parse that?
It's performance art. It's performance. You'd need a theater critic to parse that, I think, accurately. Um, it's something that the Democratic Party has been up to for a very long time, which is trying to scare blacks to the poll, to say that the other side wants to steal the franchise from you, keeping blacks angry and paranoid. That has been part of the Democratic playbook for a long, long time. Unfortunately, I think we have a president now who stolen from that playbook, and I don't support it, whether whites are doing it or blacks are doing it, whether Republicans are doing it or Democrats are doing it. But this sort of grievance politics and this politics of paranoia is something that I think is hugely divisive for the country. In terms of the substance of what Biden was saying there, it's almost laughably inaccurate. In some recent federal elections, presidential year elections, black turnout in this country has exceeded white turnout, including in states with some of the strictest voter ID laws in the country. And not only that, black people support voter ID laws along with white people. And so do Democrats, so do Republicans, so do liberals, so do conservatives. Support for voter ID laws in this country is wide and deep. There's a small segment of elites, mostly in the Democratic Party, who oppose these policies, but they are out of step with most of the voting public, and that's on a bipartisan basis. So this is just performance art on the part of the president. But that's and what's funny, I've been saying that I think with the election of President Trump in 2024, it might have been our first post-racial election, because that sort of rhetoric Biden was engaged in there doesn't seem to be working like it used to. Trump increased his percentage of the vote among minorities significantly, particularly among Hispanics and black men. And you could almost tell more in terms of how someone would vote based on their education level and their income level than you could on the color of their skin. And the opposite has been the case for a long, long time. And I'm wondering if we're starting to move away from that now. And that's why I say maybe that was our first post-racial election. What we don't know is whether this trend is unique to Trump or is something that will survive Trump after he leaves the political scene. We'll see.
Mr. Riley, final question. Let's go back to where we began. What was the goal of this book, and what are you trying to posit?
Well, again, the goal of the book is to show that there was a black middle class, a significant black middle class prior to the era of racial preferences in the 1970s. It was growing at a good clip, and if anything, affirmative action has slowed the growth of the black middle class. And I think that is a story that needs to be told and retold, because it's not something that today's political left, not the civil rights advocates, and not the politicians on the left want to highlight. They want to pretend as though affirmative action is necessary for black upward mobility, that big government programs are necessary for black upward mobility, special treatment, racial favoritism. And that is not the case. That is not what the history shows. That's not what the data shows. And the reason I wrote this book was to correct that narrative, to provide an alternative.
The Affirmative Action Myth: Why Blacks Don't Need Racial Preferences to Succeed is the name of the book. The author, Wall Street Journal columnist Jason Riley. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And thanks for listening to this week's Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. If you like this podcast, tell your friends, rate and review us, and you can follow us on social media at BookTV for more updates and schedule information. Also, are you looking for more of C-SPAN's book programming? Follow our Bookshelf podcast feed, your one-stop source for the Afterwards, Book Notes Plus, and Q&A podcasts. Discover compelling conversations with authors, historians, and thought leaders all in one place. Subscribe to C-SPAN's Bookshelf podcast today.